In the last segment, we saw that Hobbes thinks the way out of the war of all against all is to pick a single leader or small group of leaders and give that, preferably single leader, all the power. In this segment, we'll review some important ideas from Hobbes and also offer a summary of his argument. So the first important idea is that justice, morality, and law, according to Hobbes, are all the same thing. So an act is just if it upholds a contract. It's unjust if it violates a contract. An act is morally good if it upholds a contract. It's morally bad if it violates a contract. All justice, all morality, all such norms stem from contracts. And remember, these contracts are made for purely selfish reasons. You make these contracts in order to escape the war of all against all. And you want to escape the war of all against all because it's dangerous to you. So all morality, according to Hobbes, stems from this kind of narrow self-interest. Now remember, the leader is not party to any contract. The leader stands outside the system of contracts and just enforces the contracts. So if you and I are citizens in a society, thinks Hobbes, there are contracts that hold between us. I give up my right to kill you, you give up your right to kill me. That's a contract. The leader does not give up any rights, and the leader enforces contracts. But correspondingly, it wouldn't be immoral for the leader to, on a whim, execute dozens and dozens of his subjects. Why wouldn't it be immoral? Because it's impossible for the leader to behave morally good or morally bad, because the leader is not involved in any contract, and all moral goodness and badness stems from contracts. So according to Hobbes, it would be maybe imprudent or foolish or misguided for the leader to execute dozens of subjects on a whim, but it wouldn't be bad. Okay, here's a question. When is it appropriate to break a contract if you're in a well-functioning state? And Hobbes' answer is that you shouldn't break any contract unless the condition that you'll be in, if you uphold it, will be worse than the war of all against all, or as I should say, as bad as the war of all against all. So consider an example. Suppose that you're being arrested by the police, and the police are going to take you off to jail for life. Should you agree? Should you assent? Should you say, well, I did break the law, since I am guilty and the punishment for breaking this law is life in prison, I should just submit and go to prison for life? And what Hobbes says here is no. He thinks that the only reason to uphold a contract is because it's in your own self-interest. So when I've given up my right to kill you and you've given up your right to kill me, he thinks, it's in my self-interest to keep that contract so long as there's a power that will punish me if I break it. So if I go ahead and kill you, that power will punish me, and I'll be worse off than I would have been had I not killed you. But if the punishment is jail for life, that's the punishment I will submit to if I uphold my end of the contract, if I violated a contract. Or the punishment is death, Hobbes thinks I should try and escape. Why? Because jail for life or execution is worse than the war, or at least as bad as the war of all against all. Put another way, if my options are the war of all against all or execution or jail for life, I might say, I'd rather take my chances in the war of all against all. And Hobbes thinks that the law of nature, which dictates, remember, that I have to preserve myself, that because self-preservation is my fundamental motivation, I ought to try and preserve myself at every step. Since the law of nature dictates that, it dictates that if I am being arrested and will be sent to jail for life or executed, I ought to try and escape. So again, the only reason for me to uphold a contract is because it's in my self-interest to do so. The moment that it isn't, I ought to break it. And there's some quotes on the slides here that you can read through. You can hit pause and read through them if you want to. They're Hobbes offering thoughts along these lines. Okay, here's another question related to the last. When is it appropriate to rebel against a bad government? So suppose you're living in a society where the government is really not well functioning. It's not serving its citizens very well. When is it appropriate to rebel? Well, I'll read this quote from Hobbes. He says, "And for the other instance of attaining sovereignty by rebellion." So the idea here is rebelling and overthrowing the current government and replacing it with one you think is better. He says, "It is manifest that, though the event follow, Yet because it cannot reasonably be expected, but rather the contrary, and because by gaining it so, others are taught to gain the same in like manner, the attempt thereof is against reason. So what does he mean here? Well, when he says it's manifest that, though the event follow, it cannot reasonably be expected, what he's saying is when you rebel, you really don't have a reasonable expectation of success. And think back to rebellions historically. Take the American Revolution. The colonists, they thought they had a chance of succeeding, but they weren't confident that they would succeed, or at least they ought not have been confident. It could have gone either way. And moreover, he says, when he says, because by gaming it so, others are taught to gain the same in like manner, what he's saying is, if you rebel and successfully take power, you've just taught other people a lesson that if they rebel against you, they might successfully take power. So not only is it unlikely that you succeed if you rebel, but even if you succeed, your hold on power will be tenuous because the very fact that you succeeded has taught others that they might succeed against you. So he thinks if you rebel against a bad government, it's a pretty bad idea. It's, first of all, a risk that you'll lose and then you'll be harmed. Second of all, there's the risk that you'll succeed in the sense that you'll overthrow the current government but fail to establish a new government, in which case you'll be back in the war of all against all. And third of all, even if you succeed in establishing a new government, its hold on power will be tenuous, and again, there's a risk of reverting to the war of all against all in the next rebellion. So he thinks it's against reason to rebel because you shouldn't expect success, and even if you succeed, there's the risk that you'll end up in a worse condition than the one you're in right now under your bad government. So when then is it appropriate to rebel? It's only appropriate to rebel when the government is making your life so bad that you'd prefer the war of all against all. So if your government is so oppressive, if it is so bad that the war of all against all is no worse, then you might as well rebel. Otherwise, you ought not rebel. Notice this is a pretty hard line to cross. That is, a government that is making society as bad as the war of all against all is an abysmal government. It is a terrible government. It's far worse than any government on the planet today. So there is certainly the American Revolution, according to Hobbes, was against reason. It was a foolish decision. But just about any rebellion you can think of would be a foolish decision. You'd be better off just suffering through the bad government under which you live. Okay, so now a summary of Hobbes's argument. This is kind of putting the various steps together. And we've done this several times indirectly, but it's just going to be on a single slide now. So premise one, in the state of nature, because of competition, distrust, and the struggle for glory, we would be in a war of all against all, where each person is at the throat of each other person. There's no safety. And consequently, that poses the greatest danger to me. So in the state of nature, you're in as dangerous a state as you could possibly be in. Well, the law of nature dictates that you avoid danger. It says, hey, look, because self-preservation is your fundamental motivation, you ought to avoid putting yourself in danger. Well, if the state of nature is the ultimate danger, and the law of nature says avoid danger, it follows that you should avoid the war of all against all. The question then becomes how to do that. Hobbes says you can avoid the war of all against all only if you give up your right of nature and then keep contracts. So you make contracts and you keep contracts. So how do you give up well, first, what is the right of nature? The right of nature, remember, is the right to do whatever you want with no obligation to desist. So the idea is because there is no morality in the state of nature, there is no law, there is no justice, you have the right to do whatever you want. You have this sort of like natural right to do whatever you want, including kill, steal, lie, whatever you want that you think will be useful to you, you have a right to do it. Well, so long as you retain that right, there can't be peace. You need to give up your right to kill and steal and so on in order for there to be peace. So the only way to avoid the war of all against all is to give up the right of nature. And the only way to give up the right of nature is to make contracts with people, is to agree, hey, I won't kill you if you don't kill me. So now we have these two claims. You should avoid the war of all against all, and you need to make contracts giving up the right of nature in order to do that. So we get the conclusion that you should give up the right of nature by making and keeping contracts, provided that others will do the same. Well, people, including you, are going to keep contracts only if there's an all-powerful leader to enforce them. The idea is, remember, if I make a sort of informal agreement with you and we shake, or even formal, we shake hands, but there's no power behind it, I have every incentive to break it. Why? Well, I know that you might break it when it's to your advantage. And given that you might break it when it's to your advantage to break it, I really ought to break it first so that I don't lose out. The only way to avoid this dilemma where each of us has a motivation to break the contract is to have a power standing behind us with a bludgeon ready to beat down anybody who breaks the contract. And then it's in my self-interest to keep the contract because I know if I break it, I'm going to get clubbed in the head with this bludgeon. Okay. So put these together. I should give up the right of nature by making and keeping contracts provided that other people do the same, and that the only way to do this is to have an all-powerful leader ready to enforce contracts. It follows that I should give up my right of nature and support an all-powerful leader. And that's exactly what Hobbes thinks we should do. So this is his argument that we should have a basically totalitarian state. Okay, and we'll stop there and continue in the next segment, talking about, among other things, the relevance of Hobbes's view to contemporary society.